A shadow drifted across Europe, silent and patient, slipping through the narrow alleys of Genoa before dawn had even touched the rooftops. No trumpet announced its coming. No drumbeat heralded its march, only a stillness, heavier than midnight. Fog that clung to the stones and the cobblestones, pressing against lungs and hearts alike. In the year 1347, whispers of a strange sickness threaded through markets and ports. Carried on the lips of sailors whose eyes were already hollow with fear, the air itself seemed thickened, a slow-moving veil of dread that made even the birds uneasy, and those who walked through it felt an unseen weight pressing upon them. A silent warning that death had arrived, and it carried no mercy. Merchants unloading bales of silk and spices in the bustling port of Genoa noticed the first signs in shadows and sickness. Rats scurried along the timbered docks, their tiny bodies burdened with invisible armies, fleas so small as to escape. Notice leapt from fur to flesh, bringing with them a terror that no candlelight or prayer could illuminate. Families began to vanish overnight, mothers clasping infants close in vain, children left to cry in empty kitchens, their sobs mingling with the distant sound of church bells tolling both for the living and the departed. No one knew what to call it. No one understood why it chose its victims so indiscriminately. Learned men pondered in candlelit rooms, turning parchment after parchment, while monks, hands trembling and ink flowing like sorrow, recorded the names of the dead, and the streets now emptied of laughter. The disease did not rush like a storm. It crept, it seeped into homes, crawling across thresholds and beneath doors, as if it moved with intention, with quiet deliberation. People who seemed healthy in the morning would collapse by nightfall, their faces mottled with dark sores, their breaths shallow and ragged, as if the very air had been stolen from their lungs. Markets, once filled with the hum of barter and the scent of spices, fell silent. Merchants abandoned goods and fled to the countryside. Yet even isolation offered no sanctuary. The plague moved with them, a shadow that stretched over fields and forests, over rivers and valleys, indifferent to wealth, power, or prayer. In towns and villages, fear became ritual. Families locked themselves away, staring from shuttered windows as the dead were loaded into carts without ceremony, rolled through the streets in endless processions to mass graves beyond the city walls. Carts clattered over cobblestones, there, wooden wheels groaning under the weight of bodies, and the air was saturated with the metallic tang of blood and decay. Priests walked alongside the wagons, chanting prayers that seemed to dissipate into the morning mist, their voices swallowed by an invisible void. Even kings and queens, draped in silk and gold, fell beneath the shadow's reach. Thrones grew cold. Halls that once echoed with laughter now reverberated only with fear and mourning. Advisors whispered in corridors that stank of incense and despair, but no counsel could stave off the invisible tide. Yet the Black Death's terror was not only measured in the bodies it claimed. It struck at the very heart of human order and certainty. Cities became tombs. Markets were abandoned. Monasteries overflowed with the sick, and entire villages disappeared, leaving behind only doors swinging in the wind and hearts cold to the touch. Trust dissolved into suspicion as neighbors watched one another through fog glass, afraid that a hand extended in compassion might also carry death. Children played in silence where laughter once rang. Even the seasons seemed complicit, the autumn winds carrying a chill that no fire could banish, the sun casting shadows that seemed heavier than usual. Across Europe, chroniclers recorded the horrors with trembling hands, though their words could never fully capture the depth of despair. Italy, France, England, and beyond fell into an almost sacred quietude, as though the earth itself mourned the passing of so many souls. Tales emerged of entire families perishing overnight, homes locked from within and left untouched, a testament to both devotion and desperation. Strange phenomena were whispered, black boils rising on the skin like ancient runes, blood-dark vomit pooling in candlelit chambers, rats dying in grotesque clusters in the corners of abandoned rooms. Every village and city became a stage upon which mortality acted, and humanity could do nothing but watch, powerless, while life was extinguished one heartbeat at a time. The silence, perhaps, was the cruelest part. There was no warning, no judgment, no purpose to be discerned, only the inexorable spread of something unseen, something that respected neither rank nor age. Scholars speculated, doctors faltered, and the common folk cried out to the heavens for mercy that never came. Some claimed the plague was divine punishment, some a curse, and others a simple twist of fate beyond human reckoning. But to those who lived through it, it became clear that the world had changed irrevocably. Even after the fever subsided and the pestilence receded, streets remained hollow, homes shuttered, and the memory of vanished faces lingered in the corridors of every heart. In the aftermath, communities struggled to reclaim life. Children had grown into ghosts of what once was. Crops rotted in untended fields, and monks continued to record names of the lost, etching each one into parchment as though ink could preserve the soul. Europe learned the bitter lesson of vulnerability, that the grandest cities and humblest villages alike could fall to an enemy invisible, patient, and absolute. And yet, amid the ruin, whispers of resilience persisted, small acts of courage, neighbors aiding one another, prayers uttered in defiance of despair. The Black Death, though it stole so many, also revealed the tenacity of those who remained. A flicker of light in the oppressive shadow. Even centuries later, the shadow of 1347 lingers. Empty streets, abandoned hearths, and the echo of church bells tolling for the departed remind us that mortality often travels unseen, that history holds the memory of those stolen without warning. The Black Death's silent arrival is not just an event in time, it is a myth, a sacred story of fear, despair, and human endurance whispered across generations. It teaches that life is fragile, that unseen forces shape destinies, and that, in the face of such inevitability, the human spirit's faint light is both a defiance and a remembrance. The plague, though vanished, continues to murmur through the centuries, a solemn hymn to the fragility and fleeting beauty of life, a reminder that death, silent and patient, has always walked among us. The sea had always been a living thing in the minds of those who dwelled along the coasts, a restless spirit that sang to the gulls and whispered to the fishermen at night. In 1347, it carried more than wind and water. It bore a silent plague across the waves, reaching the port city of Messina like a dark tide creeping beneath the sun's warm gaze. Ships arrived with their sails slack and hulls weathered, carrying merchants from distant lands. And yet within their timbers and cargo lay a horror invisible to the human eye. Fleas infested the rats that had hidden in the hold, each one a herald of suffering, each one a messenger of an unseen calamity. Those who stepped off the gangplank could not know that with each breath, each brush of hand to cheek, they invited death into their veins. The city, normally alive with the rhythm of commerce and the scent of spices, seemed suddenly muted, as if the sea itself had hushed in fear. Dockworkers fell first, collapsing beneath the weight of a fevered body, their limbs trembling like leaves in a harsh wind. Within days, the streets were emptying, merchants fleeing to the hills or retreating behind shuttered windows, families huddled in homes, listening to the soft scrape of cart wheels on cobblestones as bodies were moved silently to mass graves beyond the city gates. Chroniclers described the sick lying side by side in the open air while the sun blazed overhead. Indifferent to the suffering below, priests moved among them, chanting prayers that dissipated into the salting breeze, offering last rites to those whose breaths grew shallow, whose skin darkened like bruised twilight. The docks themselves became a stage of despair, ships unmanned, their sails slack, rotting cargo untouched, and the sea reflecting the sky's indifferent gray. Rumors spread as fast as the disease itself. Sailors whispered of a curse brought from distant lands, of foreign sands that carried pestilence across the waves, of merchants who died in their cabins while the gulls circled above in silence. Families barricaded themselves behind doors, though plague knew no boundaries. The wealthy, hoping that money could shield them, fled to inland estates. Yet even stone walls offered little protection. The disease moved with patient precision, indifferent to rank or privilege. Chroniclers would later record that Messina's streets became rivers of grief, and that those who had once traded goods now traded only their stories of vanished friends and neighbors. By the second week, fear had taken root in every heart. Markets remained deserted, and the harbor echoed with silence broken only by the occasional bell toll, announcing the death of yet another soul. Mothers clutched infants to their chests, whispering prayers into fevered ears. Children, too young to understand, sensed the emptiness and cried into abandoned courtyards. Every home became a sanctuary and a prison, and yet the shadow moved through them as if guided by invisible hands. Chroniclers described nights thick with the smell of decay, torchlight flickering against stone walls as the city trembled under the weight of mortality. Even those untouched felt the cold fingers of fear tracing their spines. As Messina succumbed, the plague traveled northward, crossing seas and rivers with the unrelenting patience of a predator. Each port it touched became a mirror of the horrors of the Sicilian harbor. Silent streets, carts laden with bodies, homes abandoned in despair. The disease did not discriminate, and neither did fate, leaving behind a trail of sorrow that would echo across Europe for decades. Ships, once symbols of trade and connection, became harbingers of mortality, a lesson carved into history by the invisible and untouchable. And yet, amid the silence, a certain human resilience emerged. Neighbors aided one another despite fear. Priests walked among the sick, chanting in defiance of despair. And some merchants stayed behind to care for the afflicted even as friends and family fled. In this small defiance lay a fragile light, a testament to courage in the face of something far beyond comprehension. The sea, indifferent and eternal, reflected both the darkness of the plague and the glimmer of humanity that dared to endure. Messina would never forget those weeks, nor would Europe forget the ships that carried the silent terror across waves and time. The plague had arrived without fanfare, invisible and patient, leaving grief and empty streets in its wake. Centuries later, historians and storytellers alike speak of those plague ships as spectral vessels, floating in memory, a haunting reminder that even across oceans, no one could outrun the patient hand of death. And though the waters eventually calmed, the shadow they carried never truly departed, lingering in the wind, the salt, and the silent streets that had once been alive with trade and laughter. Beneath the warm light of spring in 1348, Florence, a city of marble and art, of bustling piazzas and sun-dappled alleys, trembled under a shadow it could not name. The Arno gleamed in the morning sun, its waters reflecting the domes and towers that spoke of human ambition. Yet even as the city thrived in commerce and culture, an invisible predator moved among its streets, silent as the river's current, patient as the stones that lined its bridges. It began with whispers. A merchant fell ill. A child collapsed mid-laughter. A noble woman shivered beneath her fine silks. Soon, the city learned that the sickness spared no one. Wealth and station could not protect from the fever, the boils, the darkness that crept across skin and soul alike. By the time Florence truly understood the horror, the streets had emptied of joy. Market stalls stood deserted, their silks and spices swaying in the wind like the arms of mourners. Artisans abandoned their workshops, leaving half-finished frescoes to fade in candlelight, their brushes lying like silent witnesses to a civilization unraveling. Chroniclers would later write of families disappearing overnight, of empty homes and cold hearths, of children weeping in courtyards while mothers, already fevered and trembling, could do nothing but cradle them in despair. Monks and priests, their hands stained with ink and illness, moved through the streets attempting to record names, to administer last rites, to make sense of a world suddenly unrecognizable. The plague did not strike with sound or spectacle, but with stealth and inevitability. One night, a nobleman sat in his candlelit chamber, pen in hand, only to find his chamberlain collapsed at the door by morning. Mothers whispered prayers over fevered children whose skin darkened like bruised parchment. Neighbors watched one another with suspicion, fearing that a simple touch could carry the invisible doom. And yet, human compassion did not vanish entirely. Some braved streets of uncertainty to care for the sick, to carry them to monasteries, or to lay the bodies gently into mass graves beyond the walls. Hospitals overflowed. Streets became rivers of lamentation, and Florence felt as though it were caught in a liminal space between life and oblivion. Even the proud towers of the Palazzo Vecchio seemed smaller, diminished in the face of such indiscriminate mortality. Bells tolled ceaselessly, announcing the passing of the young, the old, the merchant, the beggar alike, superstition intertwined with fear. Some claimed celestial wrath, others whispered of poisons or secret conspiracies. Yet the disease moved on, heedless of explanation, heedless of prayer, heedless of grief. As spring turned to summer, Florence became a city of silence, punctuated by groans of fever and the soft scrape of cartwheels on stone. As bodies were transported beyond city walls, chroniclers wrote of nights where the smell of decay mingled with the scent of burning herbs meant to ward off disease. Even the Arno seemed to mourn, its waters reflecting only shadows of vanished faces. Wealth and culture, once Florence's pride, could not shield the city from the impartial hand of death. And in the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through empty piazzas and the flicker of candlelight danced against cold stone walls, the living confronted the unimaginable, the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of human endeavor, and the weight of mortality pressing against every heartbeat. Florence had been tested by an invisible arbiter, and though its people endured, they emerged forever changed, haunted by absence, memory, and the echo of a city that once laughed and now trembled. Beneath the shadow of the Black Death, the story of 1348 is not merely one of disease, but of the human spirit confronting the unseeable, and of a city learning, in the silence of its streets, that even beauty and ambition could not withstand the patient, unrelenting tide of death. The summer of 1485 brought a peculiar terror to the streets of London, one that did not resemble the Black Death, yet carried the same whisper of inevitability. It was called the sweating sickness, a disease whose origins were as mysterious as its swiftness, striking suddenly and without warning. Citizens went about their morning routines, merchants ranging wares, apprentices hurrying along narrow alleys, children chasing one another through sunlit courtyards when the first symptoms appeared. A chill would settle in the bones, a sweat that poured like molten water over the skin, a fever that raced faster than any healer could track. Within hours, some lay lifeless on their straw-strewn floors, their bodies drained of color, their breaths shallow and fleeting. The disease moved as if carried by shadows, invisible yet present, leaving panic and confusion in its wake. London, a city of timbered houses and twisting lanes, felt suddenly fragile, as though every wall could crumble beneath the weight of fear. Markets emptied as merchants fled to the countryside, leaving silks and spices to rot in the sun. The narrow streets echoed with cries that seemed to emerge from the very stones themselves. The tolling of church bells marking death after death in a city that had never known such rapid devastation. Chroniclers later recounted the horror. Families vanished in a matter of hours, parents clutching children as they succumbed to fever, servants falling beside masters, and no amount of prayer, incense, or herbal remedy could halt the relentless advance of the sickness. Physicians and apothecaries were powerless, their tomes of knowledge inadequate against a plague that defied logic. Remedies that once cured common illnesses failed. Poultices and teas did nothing to stop the relentless pounding of heat and sweat that consumed the body. Londoners whispered of curses, of divine wrath, of astrological alignments unseen but surely malevolent. No social class was spared. Merchants, nobles, and commoners alike fell beneath the invisible hand of the sweating sickness. Within the walls of the city, panic and superstition grew, neighbors watching neighbors with suspicion, afraid that a handshake or a breath could carry the unseen doom. Hospitals overflowed, makeshift wards appearing in abbeys and courtyards. Yet the sick often died before they could receive care. The sickened and the fearful coexisted in a strange limbo, their cries echoing through alleys and empty marketplaces. Chroniclers described nights in which candlelight flickered across walls, lined with trembling families, their prayers rising into the smoke-filled air. Unanswered and faint against the immensity of the unknown, stories spread of entire households, vanishing within hours, and the city became a theater of mortality, with London itself playing both stage and victim. Even as the season turned, the disease came and went with the peculiar rhythm of a shadow, appearing suddenly, leaving devastation in its retreat, and retreating without explanation. The streets of London, once filled with laughter and commerce, became silent except for the tolling of bells and the occasional groan of the sick. Chroniclers later reflected on the enigma, noting that no pattern, no cause could be discerned. Only the haunting reality of lives abruptly ended, families shattered, and a city left to confront its own vulnerability. In these quiet, fearful moments, Londoners learned the fragility of existence. Walls could not protect, wealth could not shield, and knowledge could not explain the invisible predator that visited without warning. The sweating sickness was swift, merciless, and unknowable, leaving behind not only the dead but the deep, unshakable fear that mortality could strike with the precision of shadow and the inevitability of night. Even centuries later, the story lingers in whispers, a dark lullaby for the imagination, a testament to the fragility of life, and a reminder that the unseen forces shaping history often pass without notice, leaving only silence and memory in their wake. In the sweltering summer of 1518, Strasbourg, a city of timbered houses and sunlit squares, became the stage for a terror unlike any other, one that seemed to spring from the mind of some restless god. It began subtly, almost innocuously, with a single woman stepping into the street, her feet moving in an erratic rhythm, her body shaking against her will. She danced through the narrow alleys, her face flushed, her eyes wide with a strange fever. At first, onlookers watched with curiosity, perhaps even amusement, believing it a momentary oddity. But soon, others joined, compelled as if by some invisible hand, their limbs twitching and swaying against the will of reason. The dancing plague had begun. A strange and unstoppable contagion of motion, joy twisted into terror, laughter transfigured into pain. The streets, normally bustling with merchants and children, grew crowded with bodies in perpetual motion. Men and women danced for hours, for days, until their muscles ached and their lungs burned, yet they could not stop. Chroniclers describe feet blistered and bleeding, limbs trembling to the point of collapse. Yet still the afflicted continued, compelled by a force no medicine could touch. Physicians were called, clergy prayed over the sufferers, and charms and amulets were distributed to ward off evil, but nothing stilled the rhythm. Panic spread alongside the dancers, for the city soon realized this was no ordinary sickness. It was as if joy itself had been perverted into a curse, an invisible puppeteer controlling bodies with merciless intent. Entire neighborhoods fell into chaos, streets lined with those moving like automata, the sweat of fevered exertion mingling with the summer heat. Families watched helplessly from windows, some weeping, some pleading with priests for salvation, others joining the dance. In despair, chroniclers noted that dozens died of exhaustion and heart failure, their bodies finally yielding to the relentless compulsion. Markets emptied, taverns closed, and the city seemed to sway in a grotesque rhythm dictated not by human will, but by some unseen, maddening hand. The dancing fever became legend, whispered in both fear and fascination, a mystery that medicine and faith alike could not contain. Some spoke of divine punishment, others of a curse. Yet no explanation fully satisfied the bewildered populace. Towns beyond Strasbourg trembled at the news, fearful that such an invisible, inexplicable contagion could strike their streets. Scholars would later speculate on ergot poisoning, on mass hysteria, on demonic possession. But in the moment, such words were powerless against the sheer immediacy of the spectacle. The city became a theater of suffering, a place where bodies moved even as souls screamed, where each step forward in dance was a step closer to exhaustion, collapse, and death. And yet, amid the horror, there were moments of haunting beauty. The sun glinted off sweat-slicked skin, illuminating faces twisted in agony, but also in a strange, eerie unity. The music of chaos, the rhythm of countless feet upon cobblestones, created a resonance both terrible and mesmerizing. Strasbourg had become a living symphony of compulsion and despair, a monument to the human body's fragility and the mind's susceptibility to forces unseen. When the plague finally waned, exhausted bodies collapsed in the streets, some alive, some forever silent. The city counted its dead and marked the lessons in fear and caution, though no one could fully comprehend why it had happened or what dark force had seized so many at once. Windows remained shuttered, altars were consecrated, and yet in the stillness of night, the echoes of the dancers seemed to linger, as if memory itself refused to let go. The dancing plague of Strasbourg became legend, a tale whispered across centuries, a haunting reminder that human bodies, minds, and communities can be overtaken not only by disease, but by invisible, inexplicable compulsion, leaving history to ponder the mysteries that refuse to die with their victims. Even today, the cobbled streets and half-timbered houses seem to whisper of those fevered steps, of joy turned to madness, and of the terrifying vulnerability of the human form. Strasbourg danced, suffered, and survived, yet the shadow of those weeks in 1518 remains, a dark lullaby of mortality and the strange, often incomprehensible forces that shape life, history, and memory. The city of Kaffa, perched on the rocky shores of the Black Sea in 1346, was a jewel of trade and power, its walls rising like stone sentinels against the restless waves. Merchants from distant lands arrived in its harbors, bringing spices, silk, and gold, unaware that with their cargo they carried a darkness, invisible yet inexorably potent. The Mongol armies, besieging the city from beyond its walls, brought more than catapults and swords. Chroniclers later whispered that they catapulted the dead over the ramparts, corpses blackened by pestilence, a grim and deliberate act meant to weaken the city not only through fear, but through disease. The Black Death, carried in the fur of rats and the bite of fleas, had arrived at Kaffa, bridging the gap between war and plague, strategy and catastrophe. Within the walls, citizens first noticed the stench of subtle, almost imperceptible odor of decay that clung to the sea breeze. Then came the fevered coughs, the swelling of lymph nodes, and the darkening of skin in mottled patterns like ink spilled on pale parchment. Families fell, one after another, their doors bolted yet their hearts unshielded against the relentless tide. Traders abandoned their stalls, leaving wares to rot in the summer sun, while monks and physicians, overwhelmed and terrified, attempted remedies they knew would fail. Chroniclers describe bodies stacked in corners, carts overloaded with the dead, and streets emptied of both commerce and laughter. Every alley became a theater of suffering, every home a tomb. Yet the siege pressed on, the Mongols relentless outside, the plague invisible within. The terror was not merely physical, but psychological. Walls that had once promised safety now seemed thin, permeable to a threat beyond comprehension. Citizens feared one another, whispering accusations and prayers, yet no precaution could halt. The invisible army moving among them. Those who survived the initial waves witnessed neighbors collapse in sunlight, children clutching mothers who themselves shivered with fever, and the rhythmic tolling of bells marking death in numbers too great to count. Chroniclers wrote of nights thick with despair, candlelight flickering against the walls of homes where only silence answered the cries of the living. When Kava finally fell, the survivors carried the plague aboard ships, unwittingly spreading it to Constantinople, Messina, and beyond, igniting the first waves of the Black Death across Europe. The siege became more than a military endeavor. It was a portal through which disease leapt continents, transforming isolated horror into a pandemic of unimaginable scope. The city itself was a crucible, a place where human ingenuity, faith, and courage met an invisible force with patience, precision, and indifference. Even centuries later, Kaffa remains etched in the shadow of history, a testament to the fragile barrier between human ambition and nature's relentless will. The siege was not merely remembered for the clash of armies, but for the silent, creeping death that rode upon them, a harbinger of suffering that reshaped Europe, tore at society's fabric, and left echoes of mortality that whisper still across centuries. In Kaffa, the lesson was stark: even the strongest walls cannot hold back what is unseen. And in the interplay of war and plague, humanity discovers both its vulnerability and the fragile endurance of those who survive. Venice, the jewel of the Adriatic, had long been a city of light and water, where canals reflected the sun's brilliance and gondolas swayed gently beneath arched bridges. By the summer of 1348, that brilliance was dimmed by a shadow no wall, no canal, and no prayer could contain. Ships arrived from distant ports, their hulls heavy with spices, silks, and the whispers of foreign lands hidden within the timbers. Rats carried an invisible passenger, and the city's heart beat its commerce, its festivals. Its daily life soon faltered beneath the silent approach of pestilence. Venice, with all its grandeur, would discover that even water could not wash away the inevitability of death. It began subtly, as though the city itself sensed the intrusion before humans did. Dockworkers fell ill first, collapsing beside empty barrels and abandoned nets, their cries swallowed by the lapping of water against stone quays. Merchants, who had once laughed at deals, now stumbled, clutching their chests, sweat pouring down pale faces. Families shut doors and shuttered windows, praying that isolation might shield them. Yet the disease flowed with the rhythm of the tides, indifferent to wealth or status. Chroniclers describe streets growing quiet, the hum of trade replaced by the groans of the sick, the tolling of bells marking both the passing of souls and the terror of the living. Hospitals and lazarettos became overcrowded, their walls echoing with desperation. Priests moved between the afflicted, sprinkling holy water, reciting prayers that dissipated into the thick, salty air, powerless against the unseen foe. Citizens whispered of curses, of divine punishment, and of foreign poisons. Yet no explanation could arrest the invisible tide. Venice, a city built on ingenuity and commerce, confronted a truth as ancient as humanity. No wall, no canal, no wealth could fend off the impartial hand of disease. As the weeks stretched into months, the canals themselves seemed transformed. Water that had once glittered beneath sunlight now reflected shadows of mortality. Gondolas carrying the sick to quarantine islands, boats laden with corpses gliding silently under torchlight. The city, famed for its festivals and masked balls, became a theater of despair, every square and alley a reminder of fragility. Chroniclers recorded nights when fog rolled in thick from the lagoon, mingling with the smoke of burning herbs meant to purify, carrying with it both the scent of water and decay. Venice's labyrinthine streets offered no escape. The plague moved with patient inevitability, tracing the veins of the city like a shadow seeking every pulse. Yet in the heart of that darkness, small flickers of human resilience appeared. Neighbors tended to the sick when priests and doctors faltered. Some sacrificed comfort and safety to carry water, food, and medicine across narrow bridges. In those gestures, Venice's soul endured, a quiet defiance against the relentless advance of mortality. When the disease eventually receded, the city emerged forever altered, wealth remained, art flourished, and commerce resumed. Yet memory of the invisible tide lingered in the stones, the water, and the hearts of survivors. Venice had learned that even in a city of canals, where water flows endlessly and reflects the world's beauty, mortality cannot be contained. The plague's shadow, though gone, continued to whisper through the arches, the piazzas, and the quiet lapping of the lagoon. It left a haunting lesson that life, no matter how grand or ingenious, is fragile, and history remembers not only those who live, but the invisible hands that shape their fates. In Venice, the shadow of 1348 endures, a solemn lullaby echoing. In the rhythm of the canals, a reminder that mortality moves quietly, patiently, and without mercy. Rome, the eternal city, with its marble temples and towering basilicas, had always seemed untouchable, a place where time itself bowed to grandeur and faith. But in the year 1348, even the city that claimed divine favor was not spared. The plague crept through narrow alleys and over sun-warmed piazzas, invisible as the wind, yet leaving in its wake despair heavier than any stone of the Colosseum. Markets, usually alive with merchants and the clatter of coin, fell silent. Churches, their doors wide with welcome, were empty to the faithful as fear clutched the hearts of all. From the papal walls to the humblest hovels, the Black Death knew no distinction, claiming pope and pauper alike, as though history itself had decreed the city would kneel beneath its shadow. At first, whispers of sickness were dismissed. Citizens noted fevered coughs, swollen lymph nodes, and blackened skin, and some prayed that prayer alone could shield them, but soon the truth became undeniable. Chroniclers recorded families collapsing in their homes, children clinging to mothers already lost to fever, and neighbors shutting doors against the desperate knocks of those seeking aid. Even the clergy, robed in gold and scarlet, fell, their chants mingling with the moans of the dying in candlelit chapels. Rome, a city built to endure, found itself vulnerable, its grandeur hollowed by the impartial hand of death. Hospitals overflowed with the afflicted, monks and nuns tending fevered bodies by candlelight, their hands trembling yet unyielding in care. Streets were patrolled by guards tasked with removing corpses, carts groaning beneath the weight of bodies destined for mass graves beyond city walls. The very air seemed poisoned, carrying about the stench of decay and the unspoken terror of what would come next. Chroniclers noted nights where torchlight flickered across empty piazzas, the wind whispering through arches as though the city itself mourned. Even the mighty Tiber could not cleanse the pall that settled over Rome, reflecting only shadow where once it mirrored sunlight. As the plague advanced, superstition intertwined with grief. Citizens believed the wrath of God had descended, that sins unconfessed had summoned pestilence to the sacred city. Pilgrimages increased even as mortality rose, as people sought mercy in a world that offered none. Prayers rose in smoke and incense, yet death continued its silent march, indifferent to devotion, wealth, or station. Chroniclers speak of entire families wiped out in hours, and of neighborhoods emptied as fear overcame the instinct for community. Yet even in Rome's darkest hours, traces of human resilience endured. Priests carried water and food to the sick when fear paralyzed others. Neighbors braved the streets to tend to those abandoned, and in these small acts, the spirit of the city remained, fragile but defiant. When the plague eventually receded, Rome was changed irrevocably, population diminished, culture scarred, and streets forever marked by absence. Yet monuments, basilicas, and history endured, silent witnesses to suffering and survival alike. Rome learned, through shadow and grief, that no city, however eternal, is immune to mortality's reach. The papal walls could not shield against invisible forces, and history remembered both the living and the countless lost within its streets. Even centuries later, the echo of 1348 lingers in the arches and cobblestones, a solemn lullaby of mortality and faith, a reminder that death, silent and patient, walks even among the most sacred of walls. Paris, the luminous jewel of the Seine, known for its scholars, its markets, and the soaring spires of Notre Dame, was not spared the quiet terror that had already claimed so much of Europe. In 1348, the city's streets, usually humming with the cadence of commerce and debate, fell under a hush heavier than fog. The Black Death moved through Paris as a silent wind, invisible yet palpable, slipping through alleys, across bridges, and into homes that had once sheltered families for generations. Scholars whispered of unseen forces. Merchants spoke in trembling voices of death arriving on foreign ships. And parents clutched children with a fear that made even the stone of the city seem fragile beneath the weight of mortality. The University of Paris, a center of learning and faith, became a scene of quiet horror. Students, once engaged in the study of philosophy and theology, collapsed mid-lesson, their minds succumbing to fever before the body followed. Professors attempted remedies recorded in texts centuries old, but their knowledge failed against the unrelenting tide. Courtyards, normally filled with the chatter of youthful minds, grew silent save for the groans of the sick and the tolling of distant bells. Chroniclers described bodies being carried from lecture halls to carts that moved in steady procession to mass graves, the air thick with the mingling of incense, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. The city's markets, previously alive with spices, cloth, and fresh bread, fell into silence. Merchants abandoned their stalls, leaving behind goods now rotting in the summer sun, and neighbors shuttered windows in desperate attempts to hold the invisible at bay. Families barricaded doors, yet no wall could contain the invisible hand that sought every pulse. Children cried in empty courtyards, mothers wept in darkened rooms, and the streets echoed with a rhythm of grief that seemed choreographed by fate itself. The scene reflected the gray sky above, as though even the river mourned the lives being swept from the city. Even the clergy, robed in solemnity and accustomed to tending the dying, were overcome. Priests, monks, and nuns moved from house to house, administering prayers and last rites. Yet the fever claimed many of them as well. Bells tolled continuously, marking a cadence of mortality, the sound mingling with the cries of the bereaved and the scraping of carts on cobblestones. Superstition and fear intertwined, as Parisians debated whether divine wrath, pestilence from foreign lands, or human sin had brought such devastation to the city. Amid the terror, small acts of human resilience persisted. Neighbors helped the sick, tended the weak, and buried the dead with reverence, preserving dignity in a time that had stripped so much of it away. When the plague finally receded, Paris had changed irrevocably. Streets remained hollowed by absence, homes bore the silence of vanished families, and the collective memory of mortality lingered in the stones of the city. The scholars who survived returned to their books, forever marked by the fragility of life and the shadow that had passed through the city. Paris learned, as all of Europe did, that even the brightest lights, its art, its knowledge, its commerce could not banish the shadow of death. The city's spires and bridges became eternal witnesses, silent chroniclers of suffering, endurance, and the invisible forces that shape human fate. And even centuries later, the echoes of 1348 remain, a solemn lullaby of mortality whispered across the Seine, a reminder that life's brilliance is fragile, and that history itself carries the memory of those claimed by the Black Death's patient hand. Norway, with its jagged fjords, pine-clad mountains, and villages clinging to the edges of frozen waters, seemed a world apart from the fevered streets of southern Europe. Yet in 1349, the Black Death crept into this northern land, carried silently across seas by trading ships, its presence invisible yet absolute. Fishermen who set out at dawn returned with empty nets, their bodies trembling with fever, their faces mottled with dark blotches, and soon entire coastal villages felt the shadow of a disease they could neither see nor fully comprehend. The wind howled through the fjords like a lament, carrying with it the scent of salt and smoke, mixing with the quiet cries of those who fell before family or friend could offer comfort. At first, the plague moved slowly, as though testing the land. A single household would vanish, the hearths left cold, the windows dark. Travelers brought news of illness from Bergen to Trondheim, from harbors to inland farms, each account spreading dread across a population unprepared for such an invisible predator. Chroniclers described families locked inside their timbered homes, children clinging to mothers who themselves shivered under fever, neighbors wary of one another, fearful that even a handshake might carry death. The fjords, majestic and eternal, reflected only the shadow of despair as isolation and sickness spread hand in hand. Communities attempted measures, however feeble, to contain the invisible threat. Churches opened their doors for prayers, priests carried holy water, and offerings were made to saints in hopes that divine intervention might spare at least a few. Yet the Black Death paid no heed to devotion. Entire villages were emptied, farms left untended, and the mountains echoed with the lonely cries of those too weak to rise. Boats that once carried trade and fish now transported the dead, their bodies lashed and bundled for burial at sea, the cold water swallowing them silently. leaving only ripples in their wake. Even in the harsh northern climate, human entrance flickered. Neighbors aided one another despite fear, tending the sick when priests and healers faltered, sharing what little they could. Chroniclers noted nights when torches flickered against snow-dusted rooftops, illuminating the exhausted faces of the living, their eyes hollow yet determined to survive. The plague spared no one, yet survival, even in small numbers, became a testament to quiet courage in a landscape already shaped by hardship. When the disease eventually receded, Norway's fjords bore witness to the devastation. Abandoned villages, silent harbors, and a population forever diminished. The Black Death's northern grip had reshaped life, leaving behind both empty homes and a haunting memory of mortality's reach. Generations would speak of those dark years, whispering of invisible forces carried by wind and water, of a shadow that even the mountains could not hold at bay. Norway learned that the most remote corners of the earth were not immune to fate, and that survival was as fragile as the ice that formed on the fjord's surface. Shimmering beneath the quiet, eternal sky, even centuries later, travelers along the fjords report a hush that lingers, a wind that seems to whisper stories of vanished families, of hearths that no longer glow, and of the patient, invisible hand that moves quietly through history. The memory of 1349 endures in the mountains, the waters, and the hearts of those who remember. A solemn echo of mortality in the land where nature itself seemed both protector and witness to the fragile persistence of life. Siena, perched among the rolling hills of Tuscany, had long been a city of art, devotion, and commerce, its streets winding like veins through a living, breathing body of stone and terracotta. By the spring of 1348, the city's heartbeat faltered as a shadow, silent yet unyielding, crept beneath the walls. The Black Death, carried along trade routes and whispered through rumors of contagion, found its way into the narrow alleys and sun-drenched piazzas. It began with isolated coughs, small fevers, a pallor that made familiar faces appear like carved marble. Yet in days, the disease revealed its relentless nature, spreading with the inevitability of dusk, sparing neither rich nor poor, noble nor beggar. Within Siena's fortified walls, panic and sorrow intertwined. Families barricaded themselves behind heavy doors, leaving children too young to comprehend the terror alone with fever and despair. Marketplaces fell silent, their vibrant stalls abandoned, their spices and silks left to wilt in the sun. Chroniclers recount carts groaning under the weight of the dead, pulled through streets lined with the fearful, while church bells tolled, ceaselessly, announcing names in an endless litany of loss. Even the grand palaces, the pride of wealthy families, could not shield their inhabitants from the shadow that crept through corridors and chambers. Indifferent to wealth or devotion, hospitals overflowed, their walls lined with the suffering. Monks and nuns moving tirelessly among the afflicted, offering prayers and potions that could not alter fate. Siena, which had once celebrated art, music, and human achievement, became a city of groans and silence. Chroniclers describe nights in which the air carried the mingled scent of incense, fever, and decay, while the city's fountains reflected the somber sky, mirrors of a community holding its collective breath. Families disappeared as if erased from memory, the streets emptied of laughter, replaced by the soft scrape of carts and the muted weeping of those left behind. Fear was palpable, pressing against every stone of Siena's walls. Superstition mingled with grief. Some saw divine punishment, others whispered of poisons carried by foreign traders. Yet the disease obeyed no morality, no human logic. It moved quietly, ceaselessly, tracing the veins of the city with the patience of death itself. In its wake, absence became a physical presence, filling homes, courtyards, and churches with hollow silence. And yet, even amid despair, human resilience shone in small acts. Neighbors tended the sick despite fear. Monks recorded names and stories so that the dead would not be forgotten. And some families sacrificed themselves to care for the most vulnerable. When the plague eventually receded, Siena was forever altered. Streets and plazas bore the memory of vanished lives, palaces remained, but the absence of so many left a quiet echo, a testament to the fragility of civilization and the inexorable hand of mortality. Siena learned that no wall, no stone, no devotion could hold back the patient approach of death. Even centuries later, the city's piazzas and alleys seemed to whisper of 1348, carrying stories of vanished neighbors, empty hearths, and the shadow that moved silently through the rolling hills of Tuscany, leaving history itself to remember both the living and the lost. Marseille, the bustling port city on the sun-scorched coast of Provence, had always been a gateway to the wider world. Ships arrived from the Mediterranean laden with spices, silks, and the murmurs of distant lands. Yet with them came an unseen invader, a patient, invisible shadow that would unmake the city from within. In 1720, the Great Plague descended, though its echoes had begun centuries earlier with whispers of the Black Death, teaching Marseille that no harbor, no fortress, no gate could halt the inexorable march of pestilence. The first signs were subtle. Merchants fell ill mid-bargain, their skin flushed with fever, their breaths shallow and ragged. Within days, households were stricken, and whispers of divine wrath spread faster than the contagion itself. The city, built upon narrow streets and crowded alleys, soon became a labyrinth of fear. Markets emptied, warehouses stood silent under the weight of rotting goods, and families shuttered their windows, hoping to hold the invisible hand at bay. Chroniclers recount the terror of seeing neighbors, friends, and servants collapse before their eyes, their bodies wasting away while prayers and remedies offered no salvation. The city's hospitals, unprepared for such a sudden onslaught, overflowed. Monks and physicians worked tirelessly, their hands trembling with exhaustion and despair, moving from bed to bed, offering what little comfort they could. The plague did not discriminate. Sailors who had traveled across the Mediterranean brought it to inland homes. Merchants who had once counted coins now counted losses of a far more personal kind. The port, once the lifeblood of Marseille, became a corridor of death, each ship carrying not only trade but grief. Each cargo hold a crypt for the unseen passengers within. Chroniclers describe nights where the smell of decay mingled with the salty sea air, where torchlight flickered across empty plazas, illuminating streets strewn with both the living and the dead. Fear became a constant companion, families abandoned, homes fleeing toward hills or distant villages, only to discover that the plague had already preceded them. Those who remained witnessed the relentless progression of illness and despair, neighbors shrinking from one another as if proximity itself might carry doom. Superstition spread alongside disease. Some claimed divine punishment, others feared foul plague. Yet the plague moved with patient indifference, leaving only absence and sorrow in its wake. Yet even amid devastation, human courage endured. Neighbors risked their own lives to care for the sick. Priests administered last rites in candlelit chapels, and some sailors refused to abandon their posts, tending both cargo and community. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Marseille emerged, a city scarred and forever changed, empty streets, grieving families, and a memory etched into stone and sea alike. The lessons were bitter, but eternal. No walls, no harbors. No human artifice could shield a city from the patient, invisible force of mortality. Marseille remembers. Its port still glimmers beneath the Mediterranean sun, but the echoes of 1720 linger in the shadows of alleys, the hush of deserted plazas, the subtle shift in the rhythm of life. The Great Plague serves as a timeless reminder that history is shaped not only by human ambition and trade, but by the silent, persistent hand of forces unseen, and that even the strongest cities must one day bow to mortality's shadow. Vienna, cradled along the winding Danube, had long been a city of music, commerce, and stone towers reaching skyward in testament to human ambition. In 1679, when the Black Death returned in waves, the centuries had not diminished. Even the grand walls and bustling markets could not withstand the invisible tide. Traders arriving from distant lands carried more than wares. They brought death wrapped in shadows, patient, silent, and inexorable. The first signs were subtle. A merchant collapsed in the marketplace, his forehead damp with fever. A child shivered. In a sunlit courtyard, a servant trembled at the edge of a fountain. Soon, whole families vanished behind shuttered doors, leaving the city's streets eerily silent except for the tolling of bells that marked both prayer and despair. At first, Viennese citizens sought comfort in faith. Priests led processions, blessing streets and chanting litanies, hoping divine intervention might stave off the disease. But the plague paid no heed to ritual, moving through alleys and homes with the precision of a shadow slipping across cobblestones. Hospitals, small and poorly equipped, overflowed with the sick and the dying. Monks and physicians, their hands trembling, recorded symptoms, offered remedies, and yet many succumbed alongside those they cared for. Chroniclers describe the relentless pace of mortality, bodies carried to mass graves. Beyond the city walls, streets emptied of laughter, marketplaces abandoned, and the Danube itself seeming to reflect the pallor and despair of the living. Fear became a constant companion. families closed doors against neighbors, worried that a passing cough or touch might carry the invisible hand. Markets that had once hummed with trade stood deserted. The scent of rotted goods mingled with incense and smoke from candles burning for protection. Chroniclers note nights where fog rolled off the river, curling through empty streets, carrying whispers of the dead and the unseen force that stalked the living. Even the grand towers of Stephansdom could not shield the city from the relentless advance of pestilence, and yet, amid despair, resilience endured. Citizens tended to the sick despite their own fear. Priests administered last rites in den chapels, and neighbors offered what comfort they could. Some risked their lives to ferry bodies to burial sites along the Danube, ensuring dignity in death even as life slipped away. When the plague eventually receded, Vienna had been irrevocably changed, families decimated, commerce disrupted, streets hollowed, and memory carved into both stone and spirit. The Danube continued to flow, indifferent to human suffering, yet its waters seemed to whisper of those lost, a river that carried not only trade, but grief. Vienna learned that even fortified cities, radiant in culture and ambition, are vulnerable to unseen forces, and that mortality moves silently, patiently, leaving absence as testimony to its passage. Centuries later, the echo of 1679 lingers, in the hush of alleys and the reflection of spires upon the river, a solemn reminder that history is shaped not only by human will, but by the invisible hands that guide fate. In the shadowed streets of plague-ridden cities, a figure emerged, strange and haunting, the plague doctor. By the 17th century, as the Black Death and its lingering echoes haunted Europe, these enigmatic figures became symbols of both fear and fragile hope. Cloaked in waxed linen and wearing masks shaped like long beaks stuffed with herbs, they moved through alleys and marketplaces with a solemn rhythm, the bells of the dying tolling behind them. Their eyes, dark and glassed, reflected both the horrors they witnessed and the desperate human attempt to impose order upon the incomprehensible. They were neither heroes nor villains, but mythic figures straddling the line between life and death, ritual and reality. The masks themselves carried an aura of mysticism. In the hollow beaks, aromatic herbs, spices, and dried flowers were stuffed to ward off the miasma, the invisible bad air believed to carry disease. Clocks ticked behind the walls as they walked, their wooden canes probing the living and the dead, guiding bodies to beds or burial carts. Some believed the beak visage itself was protective, a symbol that death could be held at bay through ritual and knowledge. Chroniclers later described them as phantoms gliding past shuttered windows, their steps a haunting rhythm in the twilight of plague-stricken streets. Yet their role was fraught with contradiction. Many plague doctors were untrained, some charlatans, others men of genuine learning confronting a foe beyond human comprehension. They wrote detailed observations, noting fevers, buboes, and the strange, often sudden deaths that marked the plague's course. Others performed rudimentary remedies, administering poultices, draining boils, or prescribing concoctions of dubious efficacy. Still, their presence was as much psychological as medical, a tangible sign that anyone was walking the streets while disease stalked the living. In cities like Venice, Marseille, and Vienna, the arrival of a plague doctor provoked awe and fear in equal measure. Children hid, adults crossed themselves, and the sick watched as these silent, masked figures moved between beds, carrying not only medicine, but the heavy weight of mortality. Chroniclers spoke of the eerie rhythm of their movements, the scratching of quills in dimly lit rooms, and the echo of wooden canes across stone floors. Even in death, their legacy endured, the image of the beaked figure etched into the collective imagination, a symbol of humanity confronting the unseen and unknowable. Yet beneath the mask and cloak lay vulnerability. Plague doctors themselves often fell, their knowledge insufficient against the invisible enemy they sought to document. Their bodies, despite layers of protection, were not immune to the fever, the swelling, the darkness creeping beneath the skin. Many vanished into the fog of history, leaving only journals, sketches, and whispered stories of their presence. Their myth persists, a dark lullaby whispered across centuries, embodying both human ingenuity and fragility in the face of forces beyond comprehension. Even today, the image of the beaked plague doctor lingers in shadowed imagination, a reminder of humanity's attempt to touch, understand, and survive the invisible. They were mediators between life and death, guardians and witnesses, navigating streets where silence and groans intertwined, where the patient hand of mortality left its mark on every stone. In their masks and cloaks, they carried both knowledge and fear, a haunting testament to the invisible tide of disease that shaped history, culture, and the memory of cities across Europe. In the rugged hills of Derbyshire, England, lies the village of Am, small and unassuming, yet destined to enter history as a testament to courage, fear, and human endurance. In the summer of 1665, the Black Death returned to England, carried innocuously in bales of cloth shipped from London. As the first villagers fell ill, their skin mottled with blackened sores, their bodies racked with fever, whispers of doom spread alongside the disease. It seemed at first a distant shadow, one that might be contained, yet the invisible enemy had already taken root. Families huddled in their cottages, parents clinging to children, neighbors wary of crossing thresholds, and the hills themselves echoed with a quiet dread that settled over Am like fog. The village faced a choice that would shape its legend, whether to flee and risk spreading the plague beyond its borders or remain, accepting the certainty of suffering to protect the wider region. Led by their rector, William Mompesson, and his predecessor, Thomas Stanley, the villagers chose a path of isolation, locking themselves within the bounds of their homes and even marking the edges of the village with prayers and barriers. Goods were exchanged with the outside world through vinegar-filled stones and timed deliveries, a ritual both practical and deeply symbolic, a contract between life and death, sacrifice and survival. Within Am, the plague did not discriminate. Houses became tombs. Families vanished behind shuttered doors, and the churchyard grew crowded with hastily dug graves. Chroniclers noted the haunting scenes, parents burying children, spouses laying their beloved to rest, all while watching others succumb in the very rooms they had inhabited together. The air was thick with the mingling scents of vinegar, smoke, and decay, punctuated by the tolling of church bells, a rhythm of grief and endurance echoing across the rolling hills. Yet, amid despair, the villagers found ritual and solace, lighting candles, reciting prayers, and performing the sacred work of tending one another. Even as fear threatened to overwhelm resolve, the isolation, though courageous, exacted a heavy toll. Records suggest that nearly 260 of Am's 800 residents died during the outbreak, a third of the village, each lost etched into stone, memory, and heart. Yet the villagers' sacrifice prevented the plague from spreading to neighboring towns, an act of communal bravery that resonated beyond mortality, leaving a legacy of moral courage and human resilience. Chroniclers would later marvel at Am, a village bound not only by geography, but by an invisible covenant of duty, faith, and fortitude. Even centuries later, the story of Am whispers across Derbyshire hills, cottages, graveyards, and the church still bears silent witness to the lives sacrificed and the courage exercised against the relentless hand of death. The village became a timeless symbol that humanity, even in its smallest enclaves, can confront invisible terror with discipline, faith, and sacrifice, preserving life beyond its own walls. In Am, the hills still hold the hush of 1665, a quiet lullaby of mortality, courage, and the haunting beauty of human choice in the face of unyielding plague. Florence, the cradle of art and humanist thought, had long been a city where marble and fresco spoke of ambition, beauty, and divine aspiration. But in 1348, even the grandeur of its palaces and the vibrancy of its markets could not withstand the creeping shadow of the Black Death. The plague arrived silently, carried along trade routes, and whispered through the corridors of the wealthy. Invisible to the eye yet absolute in its dominion, merchants, artists, and scholars alike fell, their once bright faces paling beneath blotches of black and purple. The Arno, which had long reflected the sunlight upon the city's palaces, now mirrored the pallor and despair that seeped through every street, every piazza, every courtyard. The city's heartbeat, normally alive with music, debate, and trade, faltered, markets emptied, craftsmen abandoned their workshops, and churches were filled with the groans of the dying instead of the prayers of the faithful. Chroniclers spoke of families disappearing behind locked doors, leaving empty hearths and silent kitchens. Wealth offered no refuge. Noble families who had once celebrated beauty and power watched helplessly as servants, children, and kin succumbed. Even Florence's famed guilds, the architects of its civic pride, could do nothing to stem the invisible tide. Amid this terror, art itself became a witness and a mourner. Painters, sculptors, and poets recorded the suffering, leaving behind work that would speak to centuries beyond their own. Frescoes depicted the dance macabre, a haunting parade of skeletal figures reminding Florence that death spares no one. Regardless of talent or station, artists, themselves afflicted, sometimes collapse mid-work, leaving masterpieces unfinished. Their brushes and chisels abandoned in the silence of plague-stricken halls, the city's streets became a stage where mortality and creativity intertwined, each echo of a bell tolling the passage of life and the fragility of human endeavor. Florence's hospitals overflowed, and monks and nuns moved tirelessly among the afflicted, offering comfort when cure was impossible. Families tended the sick in quiet, desperate rituals, washing fevered bodies, whispering prayers, and burying the dead with trembling hands. Chroniclers describe nights where candlelight flickered against frescoed walls, illuminating faces etched with grief, exhaustion, and fear. The city, normally a celebration of human achievement, had become a theater of suffering, its beauty shadowed by absence and mortality. Yet even amid devastation, Florence endured. The city's culture, resilient as its stone bridges, would survive plague, war, and famine. The works created during these dark months, tinged with sorrow and contemplation, became testaments to both fragility and persistence, beauty shaped in the shadow of mortality. The Black Death left Florence scarred, streets hollowed, and families vanished. Yet the pulse of art, faith, and human resilience beat quietly beneath the surface, waiting for centuries to reflect upon and commemorate the lives lost. Even today, the streets, bridges, and palaces of Florence seem to whisper the memory of 1348. The city remembers those who fell, those who bore witness, and the delicate interplay of creation and decay that defines human existence. Art became the eternal echo of suffering and survival, a solemn lullaby of mortality, reminding all who walk the cobbled streets that beauty and death are entwined, each reflecting the other across centuries, like the Arno itself, flowing forever. Under both sun and shadow, London, a city of timbered homes and narrow winding streets, had long been a place where life thrummed with trade, tavern laughter, and the clatter of hooves along cobblestone. But in 1348, that pulse faltered under the quiet arrival of the Black Death. Ships sailing up the Thames carried more than goods. Rats nested in their cargo held within their fur, the seeds of mortality. At first, the signs were subtle: a cough here, a fever there, a blackened bubo on an ankle or neck. Yet within weeks, entire neighborhoods fell silent, the streets echoing only with the tolling of bells that marked the dead and the mournful prayers of the living. The city's markets, once bustling with merchants from the continent, emptied. In a matter of days, bread lay on stalls, untouched. Spices mingled with dust. Merchants abandoned their shops, fleeing with what little they could carry, only to find illness waiting beyond the city walls. Chroniclers recount the terror that gripped Londoners as families vanished overnight, leaving doors bolted, hearths cold, and children orphaned in silence. The Thames itself, once a lifeline, seemed to mirror the despair of the city, its waters, dark and glistening beneath the gray sky, carrying both commerce and death in equal measure. Hospitals, few and poorly equipped, were overwhelmed. Monks, nuns, and physicians moved tirelessly through narrow lanes, tending to the fevered and the dying, their hands trembling, their faces lined with exhaustion. Candlelight flickered against walls darkened with soot and grief, illuminating faces etched with fear and sorrow. Some attempted remedies passed down through centuries: herbs, poultices, prayers, but all proved insufficient against the relentless advance of disease. Chroniclers described the constant scraping of carts on stone, carrying bodies to hastily dug graves, and the quiet hum of the city punctuated by cries of despair and the distant tolling of church bells. Superstition flourished as fear spread. Citizens whispered that divine wrath had descended, that poisoned wells or sorcerers had unleashed pestilence upon the city. Yet, the plague's hand was impartial, moving through every social stratum, claiming laborers, merchants, nobles, and royalty alike. Londoners shuttered windows, avoided contact, and yet no barrier could shield them from what crept invisibly beneath their roofs. The city became a landscape of absence, empty streets, abandoned shops, and homes echoing only with the memory of those who had fallen. Even amid despair, acts of courage persisted. Neighbors tended to the sick, priests offered prayers and last rites, and some citizens labored to bury the dead with dignity, ensuring the continuity of ritual in a world overcome by chaos. When the plague eventually receded, London emerged irrevocably altered. Streets bore silent witness to loss, families were diminished, the pulse of life resumed. Yet forever shadowed by memory, the city learned that its vibrancy, wealth, and walls could not protect against the patient, invisible tide of mortality. Even centuries later, London's alleys and stone bridges carry whispers of 1348, a solemn reminder that life is fragile, and history remembers both the living and those claimed silently by the relentless hand of death. Dubrovnik, the fortified jewel of the Adriatic, perched on cliffs where the waves crashed relentlessly against stone, had long been a city of maritime wealth, diplomacy, and cultured splendor. Its walls, towering and unyielding, had repelled pirates, armies, and storms alike, but in 1348, even their strength was tested by a foe invisible and unstoppable. The Black Death arrived quietly, arriving with merchants, sailors, and traders who had unknowingly carried the shadow of mortality within their cargo. At first, the city's citizens dismissed the whispers, a fever here, a shiver there, a swollen lymph node that would soon darken to black. But soon, fear transformed into horror as neighbors vanished. Families disappeared behind locked doors, and the streets became corridors of silence punctuated by the tolling of bells. Within Dubrovnik's walls, life tried to continue. Markets opened as usual, ships docked, and the rhythms of trade persisted for a fleeting time, as if the city could ignore the creeping darkness. But the plague paid no heed to normalcy. Chroniclers described households where entire families succumbed in days, their bodies removed by carts driven by those too fearful to enter homes themselves. Narrow alleys, once alive with the clatter of merchants and children, echoed with emptiness, and the scent of burning herbs mixed with the salty tang of the sea. The city's grand palaces and churches, symbols of faith and resilience, became shadowed by despair, as both commoner and noble alike fell to the patient, invisible hand of disease. The city's leaders acted with grim resolve. Quarantines were imposed, ships detained, and the sick isolated on the outskirts, a measure both compassionate and terrifying. Yet isolation could not shield the city entirely, and the plague moved like a silent tide, spreading from home to home, sparing none. Chroniclers speak of nights when torches flickered along the ramparts, illuminating streets where no one walked, reflecting the ghosts of lives erased. Even the Adriatic, eternal and unyielding, seemed to mourn, carrying away bodies and echoing the grief of the living amid devastation. Courage and human kindness persisted. Neighbors tended the sick, priests administered last rites, and those willing to risk their own mortality ferried food, water, and medicine to the afflicted. Every act of care became a quiet rebellion against death itself. When the plague eventually receded, Dubrovnik emerged changed, families decimated, commerce disrupted, and memory etched into every stone and every wave crashing against the cliffs. The fortified walls that had long symbolized safety now stood as monuments to the fragility of human endeavor. Dubrovnik learned that even the strongest city, perched between sea and sky, could not resist the patient, invisible march of mortality. Centuries later, the echo of 1348 lingers in the hush of alleys, the reflection of sun on the Adriatic, and the whisper of history carried by wind and wave. A solemn lullaby of lives lost, courage, and the enduring shadow of the Black Death. Krakow, nestled along the banks of the Vistula, was a city of scholars, merchants, and devout worshippers, its spires reaching toward the heavens in testament to human aspiration. By 1350, the shadow of the Black Death had crept across Europe's heartlands, and Poland, though distant from the southern epicenters, felt the invisible hand of mortality pressing steadily against its borders. It arrived quietly at first. A trader fell ill in a bustling market. A child shivered in a sunlit courtyard, and whispers of sickness began to thread through the city like smoke from an unseen fire. Yet within weeks, the disease claimed entire households and Krakow streets, usually alive with the clatter of hooves and laughter, echoed only with the soft groans of the dying and the mournful tolling of church bells. The city tried to resist, as any city might, seeking divine protection in prayers, processions, and offerings. Monks, cloaked in somber robes, moved from home to home, carrying both hope and the grim acknowledgement of mortality. Chroniclers recorded the subtle horrors, families disappearing overnight, doors bolted against neighbors, and the quiet despair of children left to watch their parents succumb. Markets, once vibrant with spices, cloth, and grains, fell silent, abandoned as fear permeated the cobbled streets. Even the walls of Krakow's castles and fortresses could not shield its citizens from the creeping shadow that moved unseen. Patient and impartial, hospitals, scarce and overcrowded, became crucibles of human suffering. Physicians attempted remedies drawn from ancient texts, verbal poultices, bloodletting, and prayers recited by candlelight. Yet the plague paid no heed to medicine or devotion, claiming noble and commoner alike, leaving behind a city hollowed by grief. Chroniclers spoke of nights when the fog rose from the Vistula, curling through empty streets and alleys, carrying with it whispers of the dead and the ominous silence of those yet to fall. Even the sacred bells of walled cathedral could not ward off the relentless march of mortality. Amid despair, quiet acts of resilience endured. Neighbors aided the sick, priests administered last rites, and families worked together to bury the dead, ensuring dignity even as life slipped away. The Black Death left Krakow irrevocably changed. Families vanished, neighborhoods emptied, and the rhythm of daily life shifted forever. Yet the city endured, its stones and spires bearing witness to both loss and survival. Centuries later, Krakow's streets still carry the hush of 1350. The echo of mortality lingers in the reflection of the Vistula, the shadows cast by spires, and the memory of those who fell silently behind closed doors. Krakow learned that even cities distant from the epicenters of plague are not immune to history's invisible hand, and that the courage to care for the living amidst overwhelming despair is a quiet triumph that endures beyond the shadows of death. Kaffa, perched on the Crimean coast, a fortress of stone and salt, had long been a gateway between world's traders, soldiers, and merchants passing through its harbors. Its walls a symbol of vigilance and power, but in 1346, the city became the stage for one of history's most chilling intersections of war and disease. The Mongol army, besieging the city, suffered a sudden and terrifying outbreak of plague within its ranks. Bodies, swollen and blackened, littered the battlements, and as desperation grew, chroniclers recount a horrifying tactic. The dead were catapulted over the walls of Kaffa, their lifeless forms falling among the living. In these acts, death was weaponized, a harbinger of the invisible pestilence that would soon spill beyond the city's fortifications. Inside Kaffa, panic unfurled like smoke. Citizens huddled in their homes, shuttering doors and barring gates. Yet the siege itself became a conduit for the invisible enemy. Traders and sailors, desperate to escape, fled on ships that would unknowingly carry plague across the Black Sea and into Mediterranean ports, marking the beginning of Europe's descent into the terror of the Black Death. Chroniclers describe the fear that gripped the city, families torn apart by illness, streets littered with the sick, and the walls themselves echoing with the groans of those unable to escape. Even the strongest fortifications, long symbols of human mastery over space and war, could not withstand a foe that moved unseen, patient, and absolute. Kaffa's harbor, usually alive with commerce and the rhythmic creaking of ships, became a corridor of death. Vessels carried not just goods, but bodies in invisible contagion, sailing toward Constantinople, Genoa, and beyond. Markets emptied as merchants abandoned their stalls, the smell of decay mingling with salt and sea spray. Priests moved through the streets, blessing homes and bodies alike, their prayers audible only against the distant cries of the dying. Chroniclers noted nights where torchlight flickered across walls, illuminating the ups and the empty courtyards, deserted docks, and silent marketplaces, all marked by the hand of an unseen enemy. Amid despair, acts of human courage persisted. Citizens risked their lives to care for neighbors, sailors tended the sick on ships, and chroniclers recorded the names of those who fell, ensuring memory would outlast the plague. Kaffa endured, but at immense cost. Its people would forever remember the siege not only for the weapons of men, but for the invisible force that entered their city through the very methods they had once mastered: trade, travel, and survival. Even centuries later, the story of Kaffa whispers through history. Its walls and harbors bear witness to the entwined horrors of war and disease, a reminder that human ingenuity, while powerful, is fragile in the face of the patient, invisible hand of mortality. The siege became legend, a dark lullaby of plunder, fear, and the unseen tide that would soon reshape the continent, reminding all that the Black Death shadow travels where humanity least expects it. Milan, the heart of Lombardy, gleamed with palaces, bustling markets, and the hum of artisans shaping marble, cloth, and glass. By 1350, the city's vibrancy was shadowed by whispers of disease. As the Black Death swept northward, touching Italy with its invisible hand once more, the plague did not announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It arrived quietly, carried along trade routes, through the voices of merchants, the feet of travelers, and the unassuming bundles of goods. One by one, families fell ill, their faces mottled with dark blotches, their bodies trembling with fever. their breaths shallow as the city's rhythm slowed to a mournful cadence. Within Milan's grand palaces, the nobility accustomed to power, wealth, and indulgence found no sanctuary. Princes and dukes draped in silk and gold witnessed the fragility of status as servants, children, and consorts succumbed with merciless speed. Chroniclers spoke of halls once filled with music and laughter now empty, echoing only the groans of the dying and the whispered prayers of those too weak to rise. Markets fell silent, artisans abandoned their workshops, and even the grand churches, normally bustling with devotion, became sanctuaries of grief rather than of faith. Candlelight flickered across frescoed walls, illuminating faces etched with fear, sorrow, and resignation. Hospitals overflowed, their stone walls reverberating with cries. The air thick with smoke from incense, fever, and despair. Physicians applied remedies drawn from ancient text poultices, herbal infusions. Prayers, yet the disease moved with patient indifference, claiming noble and commoner alike. Chroniclers described families disappearing behind shuttered doors, leaving courtyards empty, stairways silent, and hearts cold. Even Milan's walls, bastions of civic pride and defense, could not protect against a force invisible, impartial, and unstoppable. Yet in the shadow of death, human resilience emerged. Neighbors tended the sick despite their fear. Priests moved among the afflicted, offering last rites, and some nobility, stripped of privilege, found purpose in care. Chroniclers noted that amidst grief, acts of courage persisted, food delivered to the isolated. The dead carried to graves with dignity, and prayers whispered into the night for those lost and yet to fall. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Milan bore the scars of mortality. Families vanished, streets hollowed, markets abandoned, and memory etched into stone, fresco, and soul. Yet the city endured, a testament to human endurance amidst devastation. Even centuries later, the palaces, streets, and churches whisper of 1350, reminding all who walk them that wealth and power cannot shield life from the patient hand of death, and that courage, compassion, and memory endure long after the plague's shadow has passed. By the mid-14th century, Scandinavia lay draped in forests, fjords, and frozen lakes, a land of stark beauty and austere silence. Yet no landscape, however remote, could shield it from the Black Death. In 1350, the plague crept into Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, carried not by armies or merchants alone, but by the invisible carriers that had long haunted the European continent. Ships arrived at northern ports, their hulls concealing rats that bore the disease, while travelers and traders unwittingly brought contagion to villages tucked deep among mountains and forests. At first, the signs were almost imperceptible. A fever here, a swollen gland there, a pallor that seemed to drain the color from faces accustomed to harsh sunlight and snow. The plague moved silently, patient as winter, yet far more lethal than the storms that battered the coasts. In Norwegian fishing villages, families huddled behind wooden doors, eyes wide with fear as neighbors succumbed one by one. Chroniclers described nights with smoke from hearths mingled with the biting chill of the north wind, carrying the scent of illness and despair through streets that had once echoed with children's laughter. Markets fell silent, ships stayed docked, and monasteries, long sanctuaries of both learning and devotion, became houses of grief where the sick and dying awaited the merciless hand of fate. Even in the frozen lands, superstition and fear intertwined. Some believed the plague was punishment for sins unseen. Others whispered that witches or sorcerers had conjured the invisible enemy. Churches rang their bells ceaselessly, priests moved among the sick with trembling hands, and offerings of herbs and prayers were placed at thresholds. Yet the disease paid no heed to rituals. It claimed farmers, fishermen, and nobles alike, leaving the stark northern landscapes haunted not by snow, but by absence, empty cottages, abandoned fields, and frozen graves marking the relentless passage of death. Yet resilience endured. Villagers tended the sick despite fear, monks documented the toll of disease, and communities attempted isolation, barricading the infected in cabins or along the frozen rivers. These acts of courage were quiet and often invisible, but they preserved fragments of life in a region otherwise battered by plague's unrelenting hand. When the disease eventually receded, Scandinavia was forever altered, population decimated, settlements emptied, and the rhythm of daily life shifted beneath the shadow of mortality. Centuries later, fjords, forests, and frozen lakes still whisper of 1350, carrying stories of vanished families, silent hearths, and the invisible hand that swept relentlessly across even the most remote lands. In these frozen reaches, The Black Death left not only death, but a solemn lesson that no landscape, no wall, no natural barrier can withstand the patient, unseen march of history's invisible forces. Avignon, perched along the sunlit banks of the Rhine, had long been a city of splendor, power, and devout authority. In the early 14th century, it had become the seat of the papacy, a place where cardinals, clerics, and nobility gathered beneath the shadow of grand palaces and vaulted chapels. Yet in 1348, even the sanctity of papal walls could not hold back the Black Death. The plague arrived quietly, slipping along trade routes and riverways, carried in the fur of rats and the breath of travelers. At first, it appeared as a distant rumor, fever here, a small rash there, a cough whispered behind closed doors. But soon, it became impossible to ignore as entire households fell, collapsing with blackened sores and the rattling of lungs. The city, steeped in faith, sought protection through prayer, penance, and processions. Priests led solemn parades through sunlit streets, sprinkling holy water, chanting litanies, and blessing homes. Yet the plague ignored devotion. Chroniclers speak of streets lined with the dying, carts groaning under the weight of the dead, and the walls of palaces echoing only with the groans of those too weak to rise. The grand halls, once filled with candlelight, debate, and music, became sanctuaries of despair, their marble and fresco witnessing suffering that no wealth or power could prevent. Even the papal court was not spared. Cardinals, cloaked in crimson and gold, fell beside their attendants. Families vanished behind shuttered doors. Courtyards echoed with emptiness. The rain, gleaming beneath the summer sun, reflected not prosperity, but a city shadowed by mortality. Chroniclers describe nights where candlelight flickered across streets deserted by commerce, while the tolling of church bells marked the relentless advance of an enemy unseen and unstoppable. Amid fear, acts of courage endured. Servants tended the sick, clergy administered last rites, and even the wealthy risked their own safety to provide food, medicine, or comfort. Some erected quarantine measures, sealing off neighborhoods to prevent further spread, while others documented the toll of disease in meticulous records, hoping memory might outlast death. Each act, small and fragile, was a rebellion against the patient, invisible hand that swept through the city when the plague eventually loosened its grip. Avignon bore the marks of devastation, families decimated, neighborhoods emptied, and the pulse of life slowed beneath the weight of grief. Yet the city endured, its walls, palaces, and churches silently bearing witness to the fragility of life and the impermanence of power. Even centuries later, Avignon's sunlit streets and shadowed alleyways carry whispers of 1348, a solemn reminder that mortality respects neither status nor sanctity, and that courage, devotion, and memory endure long after the Black Death's shadow has passed. Seville, basking beneath the unrelenting Andalusian sun, had long been a city of oranges, gold, and song. Its streets shimmered with heat, markets overflowing with spices and silks, and the Giralda Tower casting long shadows over plazas alive with merchants and pilgrims. Yet in 1647, the city became a stage for one of Europe's most devastating encounters with plague. What arrived was silent, patient, unseen, the Black Death returning in waves that centuries had not diminished, threading itself through trade, travel, and daily life with ruthless indifference. At first, the signs were subtle, a fever here, a swelling there, the first dark blotches spreading across the skin, but soon it became a creeping terror, moving through homes, workshops, and alleys with the inevitability of dusk. Seville's vibrancy faltered, the thrumming of horse hooves, the shouts of merchants, and the laughter of children gave way to a mournful quiet. Markets emptied, fountains stood unused, and courtyards that had been full of life became silent. Chroniclers describe households where entire families vanished overnight, doors left bolted, kitchens cold, and candles flickering in lonely windows. Even the cathedral, with its soaring arches and bells that had long marked civic rhythm, became a sanctuary of grief, echoing with the groans of the afflicted and prayers that seemed swallowed by the heavy, sun-warmed air. Hospitals and infirmaries, already sparse, were soon overwhelmed. Physicians, apothecaries, and clergy moved tirelessly among the sick, their hands trembling, faces drawn with exhaustion, bearing herbs, poultices, and prayers. Chroniclers recount nights with smoke from burning incense mingled with the smell of fever and decay, drifting across empty streets, carrying the quiet horror of mortality. Families barricaded themselves indoors, wary of contact, while children, left behind or orphaned, watched the slow disappearance of their loved ones. Yet, even amid despair, human courage persisted. Neighbors risked contagion to care for the sick, priests administered last rites by candlelight, and volunteers carried the dead to hastily dug graves outside the city. Acts of quiet heroism threaded through the shadowed streets, fragile lights. Against the overwhelming darkness of disease, Seville endured, scarred and hollowed, but alive. When the plague finally receded, the city was forever changed. Streets bore silent witness to absence, families were broken, and memory settled into stone, hearth, and soul. Even centuries later, the sunlit streets of Seville whisper of 1647, of lives stolen silently, of courage found in shadow, and of mortality that moves unseen, patient, and absolute. In every echo, every empty courtyard, the city remembers. A solemn lullaby of life and loss beneath the Andalusian sun. Constantinople, the jewel straddling the continents, had long been a city of domes and minarets, of bustling bazaars and golden mosaics glinting beneath the Mediterranean sun. In 1347, it became one of the first great European cities to face the full terror of the Black Death, as trade routes from the east brought not only silk and spices, but also rats and fleas carrying the invisible plague. At first, the signs were whispered rumors, merchants falling ill, children coughing in sunlit courtyards, a sudden pallor in the faces of palace attendants. Yet the disease, patient and unyielding, soon moved through Constantinople with silent precision, turning the city's rhythm of life into a mournful cadence of despair. The streets that had once hummed with merchants, goldsmiths, and the calls of sailors fell eerily silent. The Grand Bazaar, filled with the scent of incense and the chatter of countless tongues, emptied within weeks, leaving stalls of silks, spices, and trinkets abandoned. The air heavy with dust and the faint tang of decay. Families vanished behind shuttered doors, their absence marked only by faint smoke curling from hearths, candles flickering in windows, and the tolling of church bells that carried both prayer and lamentation across rooftops and along the Bosphorus. Even the opulent palaces of the emperors could not shield those within from the relentless march of death. Courtiers, servants, and nobles alike succumbed to the invisible hand that knew no hierarchy. Hospitals and infirmaries overflowed as physicians, and monks moved tirelessly among the sick, administering remedies drawn from centuries-old texts, poultices, herbal infusions, prayers, and charms. Yet the plague respected none of these efforts. Chroniclers describe nights with lamplight reflected upon mosaics of saints, illuminated faces drawn with fear and grief, the groans of the dying echoing through vast halls that had once resounded with music and ceremony. Streets became corridors of absence, alleys lined with bodies, and bridges spanning the Golden Horn carrying the weight of grief alongside commerce. Amid the devastation, courage persisted in quiet forms. Servants tended their masters even as they themselves fell ill. Priests delivered last rites in dim chapels, and neighbors offered food and water to those isolated in fear. Each act of care became a fragile rebellion against the patient, invisible hand of mortality. The city endured, though scarred and hollowed, its spires and walls bearing witness to grief, loss, and the impermanence of life. When the plague finally ebbed, Constantinople was irrevocably changed. Families decimated, neighborhoods emptied, and the pulse of the city slowed beneath the weight of absence. Yet even centuries later, the domes and minarets whisper the memory of 1347, a haunting testament that mortality moves unseen, patient, and impartial. In every shadowed alley, every empty market, and every quiet courtyard, the city remembers. A solemn lullaby of human fragility, courage, and the enduring shadow of the Black Death. Bruges, the Venetian-like jewel of Flanders, had long been a city of winding canals, cobblestone streets, and the rhythmic clatter of merchants' wheels carrying bales of wool and spices. By the mid-14th century, the Black Death had reached the Low Countries, slipping silently along trade routes that connected the city to the wider European world. At first, the signs were subtle of fever here, a blackened sore there, a cough that rattled behind closed doors, but soon the plague revealed itself with relentless certainty. Canals that had reflected the golden sunlight now mirrored a city hollowed by grief, their waters carrying both commerce and the invisible weight of death. The markets that had been the lifeblood of Bruges fell silent, stallholders abandoned, their wares, barrels of wine rotted, and the rich scents of spices and leather were replaced by the faint tang of decay. Chroniclers wrote of entire households disappearing in a matter of days. doors bolted against neighbors, and courtyards empty save for the stray cat or bird that ventured among the abandoned benches. The city's narrow streets echoed with the solemn tolling of church bells, marking the passage of the living and the dead alike. Even the grand guild halls, once filled with laughter, song, and the meticulous clink of artisans at work, became ghostly chambers of silence, their frescoes and carvings witnessing a sorrow they could not alleviate. Hospitals overflowed, and the clergy, doctors, and lay volunteers moved tirelessly through the city, their steps echoing along the stone bridges that spanned the canals. Remedies were offered, herbs, poultices, prayers, but the disease was patient and indifferent, sparing neither wealthy merchants nor the laborers who hauled goods through the city. Chroniclers noted nights when the lamps cast long, trembling shadows across empty streets, the water reflecting faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Families barricaded themselves indoors, watching the slow disappearance of their neighbors, often succumbing in isolation, the sound of mourning echoing softly through shuttered windows. Yet even amid despair, acts of courage and devotion endured. Neighbors risked contagion to care for the sick, priests delivered last rites by lantern light, and citizens labored to bury the dead with care, preserving dignity in the midst of relentless mortality. When the plague receded, Bruges emerged scarred but resolute, its canals and streets forever marked by absence and memory etched into stone, water, and soul. Centuries later, the canals of Bruges still whisper of the mid-14th century. Their waters carry reflections not just of bridges and spires, but of vanished families, silent markets, and the patient, invisible hand that shaped the city's history. Bruges remembers, a solemn lullaby of life, loss, and the endurance of human courage beneath the shadow of the Black Death. Paris, perched along the winding Seine, had long been a city of scholars, merchants, and the lofty ambitions of kings and philosophers alike. Its streets echoed with debate, music, and the bustling rhythm of daily life, from the open-air markets to the towering spires of Notre Dame. But in 1347, the Black Death arrived silently, carried by merchants and travelers along trade routes, slipping into the very heart of the city. At first, the signs were subtle: a fever here, a swelling there, a blackened sore on a hand or neck, but within weeks, the invisible tide of death had begun to sweep through Paris with relentless, impartial force. The city's vibrancy faltered. Markets, once crowded with the calls of vendors and the scent of fresh bread, emptied. Streets that had been filled with laughter and argument became corridors of absence, silent save for the tolling of church bells that marked the passing of the living and the dead alike. Chroniclers describe households disappearing almost overnight, doors bolted against neighbors, hearts growing cold, and children watching their parents vanish into illness and despair. Even the great halls of kings and nobles offered no refuge. Courtiers, advisors, and servants fell with terrifying speed, the elegance of silk and gold powerless against the patient hand of the plague. Hospitals overflowed, their stone walls reverberating with groans and whispered prayers. Physicians applied remedies of herbs, poultices, and bloodletting, while clergy administered last rites beneath flickering candlelight. Yet all were ultimately powerless against the disease that moved silently, impartially, and without mercy. Chroniclers spoke of nights when torchlight illuminated empty streets, of carts carrying bodies to hastily dug graves, and of a city draped in mourning, every corner whispering the fragility of life. Amid despair, courage persisted in small acts. Neighbors risked contagion to care for the sick. Priests moved among the afflicted offering comfort, and volunteers buried the dead with dignity. Each act of compassion became a fragile rebellion against the overwhelming shadow of mortality. When the plague finally receded, Paris emerged forever altered. Streets bore silent witness to absence, families were fractured, and the rhythm of life had shifted beneath the weight of grief. Yet even centuries later, the Seine reflects not only sunlight upon its bridges, but also memory of vanished voices, silent markets, and the patient, unseen force that swept relentlessly through the city. Paris remembers, a solemn lullaby of life, loss, and the quiet endurance of humanity beneath the shadow of the Black Death. Venice, the city of mirrors and water, gleamed like a jewel in the Adriatic, its labyrinth of canals reflecting sunlight upon palaces of marble and gilded stone. By 1348, the Black Death had reached this mercantile marvel, slipping silently aboard ships that brought goods, merchants, and death from distant ports. At first, it arrived almost imperceptibly: a fever in a gondolier, a swelling on a dockworker's arm, a whisper among merchants that sickness had touched a neighbor's family. But soon, The disease moved through Venice with the inexorability of the tide, patient, silent, and absolute. The city's vibrancy faltered, markets emptied, stalls of spices and fabrics left untouched, and the clatter of oars against water grew faint as gondoliers abandoned the canals. Chroniclers describe homes locked and shuttered, courtyards deserted, and the scent of vinegar and burning herbs mingling with the briny air. Even the grand churches and palaces, once alive with music, art, and ceremony, became sanctuaries of mourning, their mosaics and frescoes witnessing suffering they could not avert. The patient hand of death spared neither noble nor merchant, artisan nor servant. Venice itself became a labyrinth of silence, canals carrying reflection rather than commerce. Hospitals overflowed with the sick. Physicians and clergy moved tirelessly along narrow streets and bridges, offering herbs, prayers, and comfort where cure was impossible. Families vanished behind bolted doors, carts creaked under the weight of the dead, and the tolling of church bells echoed across canals now choked with absence. Chroniclers wrote of nights when the moonlight glinted off water that bore witness to loss, reflecting empty piazzas and the faint silhouettes of those too afraid to leave their homes. Yet even amid despair, courage and devotion persisted. Neighbors tended the sick, priests administered last rites by flickering candlelight, and citizens risked infection to ferry food and water to the afflicted. Venice endured, scarred and hollowed, but alive, each act of care a quiet rebellion against the relentless, invisible force that had claimed so many. When the plague finally receded, Venice emerged changed forever. Canals mirrored grief, families were decimated, and memory settled in stone, water, and spirit. Even centuries later, the city's bridges and narrow alleys whisper of 1348, a solemn testament to mortality, courage, and the enduring shadow of the Black Death. Florence's surrounding countryside, once vibrant with vineyards and olive groves, became a quiet stage for suffering in the wake of the Black Death. Villages that had thrived with the rhythm of agriculture fell silent as laborers vanished, leaving fields untended and livestock abandoned. The plague moved unseen through the valleys, carried by travelers and the occasional wandering merchant, leaving behind empty homes and shuttered churches. Chroniclers recount the mournful sight of villages where doors hung ajar, fires burned low, and only the wind moved through empty streets. The countryside revealed both despair and resilience. Farmers tended the sick when able, priests offered prayers beneath half-empty chapels, and communities erected temporary graves for the dead. The rhythm of daily life slowed to a haunting stillness, yet the earth itself persisted, indifferent to human suffering. Vineyards and olive groves bore witness to grief as farmers buried the dead and tried to coax life from the soil, even as mortality's shadow loomed. When the plague ebbed, the landscape bore quiet scars, villages depopulated, feasts forgotten, and the cycle of harvest forever altered. Yet life persisted, and centuries later, the hills, rivers, and fields of Tuscany whisper of vanished voices, empty hearths, and the invisible hand that reshaped both city and countryside. Finally, the remote islands of the North Atlantic, from Iceland to the Orkneys, felt the distant approach of plague through returning fishermen and traders, isolated by cold seas. These communities might have believed themselves safe, yet the Black Death moved with patient determination, reaching even the frozen and windswept settlements. Fishermen fell first, the disease arriving in small, unseen packages with returning vessels. Entire families disappeared in days, leaving homes empty and hearts cold. Chroniclers wrote of how even the vast, unforgiving landscape could not protect life as death traveled along the narrow paths and frozen shores. In these isolated settlements, resilience was both necessary and tragic. Villagers tended the sick, priests offered prayer,